When my grandfather moved into my apartment, I honestly thought it would only be temporary. That's what my mother kept saying anyway, just for a few months until we figure things out. The problem was that nobody in the family actually wanted to figure things out. It just not anymore. My grandfather, Walter, had been living alone in Arizona for years after my grandmother died. At first, he managed fine by himself, but over the last year, things started getting worse. Small things at first, forgetting appointments, leaving food out overnight, calling family members, and repeating the same conversations multiple times. Then things escalated. One of the neighbors found him wandering outside barefoot at almost 4 in the morning during winter. Another time, he forgot where he lived entirely and ended up sitting inside somebody else's parked car for nearly an hour because he thought it was his. My mother wanted to move him into assisted living, but he refused every single time the topic came up. He became aggressive whenever somebody mentioned nursing homes or hospitals. Eventually, my mother called me crying one night and asked if he could stay with me for just a little while. And because I was apparently the only family member without children or a husband, I agreed. The first few days honestly felt normal. Better than normal, actually. My grandfather was quiet, polite, and surprisingly independent despite his age. He spent most of his time sitting near the living room window reading old magazines or watching television at low volume. Sometimes we even laughed together during dinner. It almost made me feel guilty for expecting things to go badly. "See," my mother told me during one phone call, "he's calmer around you." Maybe she was right, at least during the daytime. The nights were different. The first time it happened, I woke up around 2 in the morning because I heard movement in the hallway outside my bedroom. At first, I assumed I imagined it. Then I heard it again. Slow footsteps, shuffling softly across the apartment floor. I checked the time on my phone. 2:13 a.m. I walked into the hallway and saw my grandfather standing near the kitchen, completely motionless in the dark. The only light came from outside street lamps through the windows. "Grandpa?" He slowly turned toward me. For a second, his expression looked confused, almost frightened, like he didn't recognize where he was. Then he blinked. "Oh," he muttered quietly. "Sorry, sweetheart. Didn't mean to wake you." I asked if he was okay. He smiled tiredly. "Just old bones," he said softly. "Go back to sleep." I didn't think much about it afterward. Old people waking up at night wasn't exactly unusual, but then it started happening every night, always around the same time. Between 2 and 4 in the morning, I would wake up and hear him moving through the apartment, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes in the kitchen. Once I heard him slowly dragging a chair across the floor at nearly 3 in the morning. Another night, I found him standing beside the front door with his hand resting on the lock, not opening it, just touching it. "Grandpa?" He looked at me calmly, then smiled. "I get restless at night," he said. "Don't pay attention to an old man." I tried ignoring it after that, I really did. But eventually I started noticing something else, something worse. He wasn't just walking around anymore. He was whispering. At first, I couldn't understand the words. It sounded like random mumbling, the kind people do when talking to themselves absent-mindedly. But over time, the whispering became more constant, more deliberate, and somehow angrier. One night I woke up hearing his voice directly outside my bedroom door, whispering rapidly under his breath. I couldn't understand most of it, but I remember hearing certain words repeated over and over. "Open." Then, "Still locked." And finally, "Not yet." I sat frozen in bed staring at the door while the whispering continued for nearly a full minute. Then, suddenly it stopped. Complete silence. I slowly got out of bed and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but at the far end near the kitchen, I could see my grandfather standing with his back toward me, completely still. "Grandpa?" He turned his head slowly. The look he gave me made my stomach tighten instantly. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't sleepiness. For just a second, his expression looked genuinely hateful, cold, sharp, almost furious that I interrupted him. Then suddenly he smiled again. The expression disappeared so quickly I almost convinced myself I imagined it. "You should sleep more, Lily," he said gently. Then he walked back toward his room. The next morning he acted completely normal. He made coffee, asked me about work, even joked about how terrible daytime television had become. Meanwhile, I sat there trying to decide whether I was overreacting or slowly losing my mind. Because during the daylight, he seemed completely harmless. But every night after midnight, it felt like somebody else was walking through my apartment wearing my grandfather's face. Over the next several days, I became trapped in a routine that slowly started destroying my ability to think rationally. Every morning, I would wake up exhausted, promise myself that I was overreacting, and spend the entire day convincing myself my grandfather was simply an old man struggling with age and memory problems. Then night would come, and everything inside the apartment would feel wrong again. The strange part was that nothing he did seemed terrifying on its own. If I tried explaining it to somebody else, it would probably sound ridiculous. An old man walking around at night, mumbling to himself, staring too long sometimes. None of that sounded horrifying when described out loud, but living with it was different, because the atmosphere around him changed after midnight. The apartment itself started feeling smaller somehow, quieter, like every room was listening. And worst of all, my grandfather always seemed slightly more aware during those nighttime moments than he did during the day. A few nights after the whispering outside my bedroom door, I woke up again around 3 in the morning because I heard soft knocking somewhere inside the apartment. At first, I thought somebody was knocking on the front door. But after listening carefully, I realized the sound was coming from inside the walls. 3 slow knocks, pause, then 3 more. I sat up in bed trying to listen. The knocking continued for almost a minute before finally stopping. Then I heard my grandfather speaking quietly somewhere in the hallway. Not whispering this time, actually talking like he was having a conversation with somebody. I opened my bedroom door slightly. The hallway lights were off, but faint moonlight from the living room windows illuminated part of the apartment. My grandfather stood near the bathroom, facing the wall, completely motionless, and speaking softly. "No," he murmured. Pause. Then, "She still doesn't understand." Another pause, and then he slowly nodded his head like somebody had answered him. A cold pressure spread through my chest. "Grandpa?" The talking stopped immediately. He turned toward me slowly, and once again I saw that same unsettling expression appear on his face for just a brief second. Annoyance, not confusion, not embarrassment, almost irritation that I interrupted him. Then it vanished beneath another tired smile. "You're awake again?" he asked calmly. I stared at him. "Who were you talking to?" He looked toward the wall beside him for a moment before answering. "Your apartment makes strange noises at night," he said softly. "Old buildings talk sometimes." Then he walked back toward his room. The next day, I almost called my mother, but I already knew what she would say. "He's old, Lily. He's confused. You're overthinking it." So instead, I tried focusing on work and pretending everything was fine. But later that evening, something happened that made pretending impossible. I came home around 6 after grocery shopping and immediately noticed the apartment smelled strange. Not bad exactly, just damp, like wet dirt after rain. At first I thought maybe one of the windows had been left open. Then I walked into the kitchen and froze. There was mud on the floor. Not a little bit. Actual footprints. Dark, muddy footprints leading from the hallway toward the kitchen sink. My heart immediately started pounding because the footprints weren't shoes. They were barefoot. I followed them slowly. The tracks stopped directly beside the sink where my grandfather sat quietly at the table drinking tea. He looked up at me calmly. "You're home early." I stared down at the mud again. "Grandpa, were you outside?" He followed my gaze toward the floor. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he smiled faintly. I couldn't sleep. That doesn't answer my question. Something changed in his expression again. Very small, but noticeable. His eyes suddenly looked colder, sharper. People walk at night, he said quietly. That's normal. The way he answered made my skin crawl. Not because of the words themselves, because it didn't sound like my grandfather talking anymore. It sounded rehearsed somehow, like somebody trying to imitate casual conversation without understanding how humans normally speak. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time. I told myself it was only for peace of mind, but deep down, I think fear had already taken control of me by then. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up needing water. For several seconds, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening carefully. Silence. No footsteps. No whispering. Nothing. I actually felt relieved. Maybe things were finally calming down. Then I noticed the shadow underneath my bedroom door. Somebody was standing outside. I stopped breathing instantly. The shadow remained completely motionless, not moving, not shifting, just standing there in total silence, watching. My phone was beside me on the bed, and after several seconds of panicking internally, I finally grabbed it and turned on the flashlight. The moment the light hit the bedroom door, the shadow disappeared. Not walking away, not running, just gone instantly. I sat frozen for almost 5 full minutes before finally forcing myself to approach the door. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled unlocking it. When I finally opened the door, the hallway outside was empty, but something else caught my attention immediately. The front door at the end of the apartment was wide open. Cold air drifted slowly inside from the dark hallway outside the apartment building, and somewhere far below in the building's staircase, I heard my grandfather softly whispering to himself while walking downstairs. I didn't go after him that night. The moment I heard my grandfather's voice echoing faintly through the apartment stairwell, every instinct in my body told me to lock the door and stay inside my room until morning. So that's exactly what I did. I closed the apartment door, locked it, and spent the rest of the night sitting awake in bed with every light turned on while my mind desperately searched for rational explanations. Maybe dementia had progressed faster than we realized. Maybe he was sleepwalking. Maybe stress and exhaustion were making me paranoid. But none of those explanations fully accounted for the feeling growing inside me every time I looked at him. Because the fear wasn't only about his behavior anymore. It was about the way he looked at me during those nighttime moments, like he knew something I didn't. The next morning, he returned around 7, as if nothing unusual had happened. I heard the front door unlock while I was pretending to sleep on the couch. My grandfather stepped inside calmly carrying a small plastic grocery bag. When he noticed me awake, he smiled warmly. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I stared at him in disbelief. "Where were you?" "At the store." "At 4 in the morning?" "There's a 24-hour pharmacy nearby." His answer came too quickly, too smoothly. And then I noticed something else. His shoes were wet, covered in dark mud. I looked toward the grocery bag expecting medication or basic supplies. Instead, I saw raw meat wrapped in paper from a butcher shop. No label, no store name, just thick red liquid slowly dripping through the bottom of the paper. My grandfather followed my gaze and calmly lifted the bag slightly. "They were closing," he explained. "Discount prices." Then he walked into the kitchen before I could answer. For the rest of that day, I barely spoke to him. I stayed inside my room pretending to work while constantly listening for movement in the apartment. Around noon, I heard him laughing softly to himself in the living room. Not normal laughter, quiet, uneven, like somebody reacting to a private joke. At one point, I carefully opened my bedroom door slightly and looked out. My grandfather sat alone in the living room facing the television, but the television wasn't turned on. Static filled the dark screen, and he was staring directly into it while smiling faintly. That evening, I finally called my mother. I told her everything. The wandering at night, The whispering, the mud, the conversations with the walls, even the open apartment door. At first, she stayed silent. Then she sighed heavily. "He's getting worse," she admitted quietly. Something in her voice immediately made my stomach tighten. "Worse?" I asked. "You knew about this?" Another long silence followed. Then she finally said something that made me feel sick. "Before he moved in with you, one of the neighbors complained about hearing him outside their windows at night." I felt cold instantly. "What?" "He would just stand there sometimes," she continued softly, "in their yard, looking at the house." My grip tightened around the phone. "Mom, why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because we thought he was confused," she snapped suddenly. "What was I supposed to do, Lily? Nobody else would take him." After the call ended, I sat alone in silence trying to process everything. That's when I heard my grandfather's voice directly outside my bedroom again. Only this time, he wasn't whispering. "She told you." My entire body locked up. I slowly looked toward the door. The shadow of his feet remained visible underneath it, perfectly still. "She should have kept quiet," he said softly. Then came a strange scraping sound, like fingernails slowly dragging across the wood of my bedroom door. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stared at the door while the scratching continued slowly, patiently, almost affectionately. Then, suddenly it stopped, and my grandfather spoke one final sentence before walking away. "You shouldn't listen to people at night, Lily." I didn't sleep at all after that. Around 3 in the morning, I heard him moving through the apartment again, but this time the sounds were different. He wasn't walking normally anymore. His footsteps sounded uneven, almost dragging, and occasionally I heard soft thuds against the walls like he was bumping into them while moving through the darkness. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear. I opened my bedroom door slightly and looked into the hallway. At first, I saw nothing. Then, movement appeared near the kitchen. My grandfather slowly crossed the hallway, but something about the way he moved made my blood freeze. His posture looked wrong. His back bent too far forward, his arms hung strangely low at his sides, and while walking, he kept twitching his head sharply every few seconds like he was listening to voices surrounding him. Then he stopped moving completely, slowly turned his head toward my bedroom, and smiled. Not kindly, not warmly. The expression stretched too wide across his face, exposing far too many teeth, and his eyes looked empty, almost glossy, like something inside him had gone completely hollow. For several long seconds, we simply stared at each other across the dark apartment. Then quietly, in a voice that barely sounded human anymore, he said, "They keep asking about you." And somewhere inside the apartment, I heard knocking again. 3 slow knocks, coming from inside the walls. After that night, I stopped trying to convince myself my grandfather was simply sick. At first, I still wanted logical explanations. I wanted everything to fit neatly into something understandable. Dementia, sleepwalking, psychosis, anything. But logic stopped working once fear became constant. And inside that apartment, fear had become constant. Over the next 2 days, I barely slept at all. Every night felt longer than the last, and every sound inside the apartment immediately pulled me awake. Sometimes I heard my grandfather walking slowly through the hallway, whispering under his breath for hours at a time. Other nights, the apartment became completely silent, which somehow felt even worse because I never knew where he was. The worst part was that during the daytime, he continued acting almost normal. He asked me about work. He watched old movies in the living room. Once he even laughed at a joke during a commercial break, and for a brief second, he genuinely looked like my real grandfather again. That was the part that damaged me mentally more than anything else. Because every time I almost convinced myself things were improving, night came and everything changed again. One evening I came home from work and immediately noticed all the kitchen cabinets were open. Every single one, even the drawers. At first I thought somebody broke into the apartment. Then I saw my grandfather sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring toward the dark hallway. "You left these open?" I asked carefully. He looked at me slowly. For several seconds, he didn't answer. Then, very softly, he said, "They were looking." A cold feeling spread through my chest. Who was looking? His eyes shifted toward the ceiling. "They don't like closed spaces anymore." I stood there staring at him, waiting for the smile, the excuse, the sudden return to normal behavior. But it never came. For the first time since he moved in, he looked completely serious, completely aware. And somehow that terrified me more than all the whispering and nighttime walking combined. That same night, things became worse than ever before. I woke up around 3 in the morning because I heard furniture moving in the living room. Heavy scraping sounds echoed through the apartment, followed by slow, uneven footsteps. At first, I stayed inside my room trying to ignore it, but eventually the sounds became too loud, too violent. So I forced myself into the hallway. The moment I stepped out of my bedroom, I froze. The entire apartment looked wrong. Every chair from the kitchen had been moved into the living room and arranged in a large circle facing inward. The lamps were turned off. Only pale moonlight illuminated the room through the windows, and standing motionless in the center of the circle was my grandfather. His back faced me, but even from behind, something about him looked unnatural. His body seemed tense, almost twisted slightly forward, like his muscles were tightening beneath his skin. And then I heard him speaking again. Only now he sounded different. His voice no longer resembled tired old whispering. It sounded focused, clear, like somebody having a serious conversation. "She hears them now," he murmured softly. Pause. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes." Another pause. Then he smiled. I could hear it in his voice. "No," he whispered. "She won't leave." My entire body went cold. "Grandpa?" The moment I spoke, every sound stopped instantly. He slowly turned toward me, and I felt genuine panic for the first time since this nightmare began, because his expression looked completely empty. Not angry, not confused. Empty. Like whatever humanity still existed inside him had finally disappeared. Then very calmly he asked, "Why are you awake?" I couldn't answer. I just stared at him while my heartbeat hammered violently inside my chest. And then something happened that finally broke me. From somewhere inside the apartment walls, I heard whispering. Multiple voices, quiet, overlapping, impossible to understand. I ran back into my bedroom and locked the door immediately, while the whispering continued faintly through the walls around me. That was the moment I finally accepted something I had been avoiding for days. I couldn't live with him anymore. Whatever was happening to my grandfather, I was no longer safe near him. The next morning, after barely sleeping at all, I called a psychiatric emergency service. Even making the call filled me with guilt. Part of me still felt like I was betraying him. But another part of me was terrified that if I waited any longer, something irreversible would happen. The woman on the phone listened carefully while I explained everything. The nighttime wandering, the conversations with non-existent people, the increasingly unstable behavior. She told me they would send professionals the following afternoon. When I hung up, I noticed my grandfather standing silently in the hallway watching me. I have no idea how long he had been standing there. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then slowly, he smiled. The next day, 2 men from the psychiatric unit arrived just before evening. To my surprise, my grandfather didn't resist at all. He calmly put on his coat and walked toward the front door while the 2 workers stayed beside him carefully. As he stepped outside, he suddenly stopped. Then he turned his head toward me one final time, and smiling softly, he said, "See you later." The moment the car disappeared down the street, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a week. Relief. Real relief. For the first time since he moved in, the apartment finally felt quiet again, normal again. That night I showered, ordered food, and even watched television for several hours trying to calm myself down. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, And sometime after midnight, I finally fell asleep peacefully. Then my phone rang. I woke up suddenly in complete darkness, disoriented and confused while the ringtone echoed loudly through the room. I grabbed the phone from my nightstand. Unknown number. Still half asleep, I answered. A nervous voice immediately spoke. "Miss Carter, this is St. Mercy Psychiatric Center. We need you to remain calm." The moment she said that, every bit of exhaustion vanished from my body. What happened? There was a brief pause. Then the woman quietly said, "Your grandfather escaped approximately 20 minutes ago." My blood turned ice cold. What? "We believe he may attempt returning to your residence. Police have already been contacted." At that exact moment, with the phone still against my ear, I reached toward the bedside lamp and switched it on. Warm yellow light flooded the bedroom, and in the far corner of the room, my grandfather stood silently in the darkness, completely motionless, watching me. His expression looked calm, almost peaceful, but his eyes looked wrong, too focused, too aware, like he had been standing there for a very long time waiting for me to wake up. The woman on the phone kept talking frantically, but I couldn't hear her anymore, because my grandfather slowly smiled, and in a soft, gentle voice he said,
Hi, Lily.